Hello, and welcome to the North Asia Cape Need to Know series. I'm Amber Older. The North Asia Cape is committed to helping New Zealand businesses internationalize in China, Japan, and Korea. As part of this commitment, we host a monthly series of expert talks. Recently, business journalist Rod Oram presented One Bed, Two Dreams, Fonterra's Travails in China. Rod Oram joins me now to discuss the key points of his talk. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you.
So tell me about the Chinese proverb that you cited at the start of your talk, one bed, two dreams. How does that relate to Fonterra's experience in China?
It's one of those very pithy aphorisms, which is exactly what it says. You can imagine one bed, i.e. a situation people find themselves in, where they have different agendas, different dreams. So it's obviously has wide applicability, whether in personal relationships or business. But it basically comes down to the idea of two people who find themselves together might end up having quite different agendas or views of the world, which makes life rather complicated for them.
Indeed, and that leads to very nicely to the next question, because in your presentation you talked about some of your key concerns about Fonterra's investment in Being Mate. They range from strategic missteps, a failure to recognize and manage reputational crises, and a governance structure, which both companies seem to have. They lack transparency and leadership. So let's talk about some of these issues. In terms of the strategic missteps that Fonterra has made in its relationship with Being Mate, how did that start?
From Being Mate's point of view, it would give it better access to foreign ingredients. And so part of the deal was it take a 51% stake in the Darnham plant in Victoria, and it would have access to Fonterra skills elsewhere, and then it would also have access to Fonterra's main infant formula brand, Anmum, for sale through Being Mate's networks. And from Fonterra's point of view, it was securing a relationship with a major customer for ingredients. It looked as though it was going to give Fonterra access to a big distribution network. Being Mate was an interesting company at the time because it had a large number of independent retail and outlets around the country, and a few of its own, and so it was kind of like a franchise relationship, to sell the Being Mate product through those stores, but a big network. And so they agreed in August 2014, signed a memorandum of understanding to take up to a 20% stake. Fonterra take a 20% stake, and that deal was finally consummated in March of 2015, with Fonterra buying an 18.8% stake at a higher price than it thought back in August. So that became a $750 million investment. So that got us to the starting point with Being Mate.
So there were obviously lessons that weren't learned. Would you say that Fonterra went into Being Mate maybe in denial about some of the mistakes and missteps that it made previously?
It's very clear that Fonterra seemed not to have learnt those lessons from Sanyu. So, for example, starting with board representation, Fonterra had the right to suggest to members of the Being Mate Baby and Child Food Board, but as I understand it, it wasn't an outright right to have those two people on the board. It was an invitation to nominate somebody. So the two people they nominated was Christina Zhu, who is Fonterra's head of Greater China. So that's the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong and Taiwan. And her predecessor in that role, Johannes Priem, who had been a colleague of Theo Spearing's, Fonterra's chief executive, at Friesland Campina, the big Dutch dairy co-op, before Spearing's came to New Zealand. And of the two of them, Zhu is a Chinese national, had grown up in China before she went overseas to, I think, study for business and then work in a number of major companies. It was clearly a Mandarin speaker. But Priam, Fonterra has confirmed to me, doesn't speak Mandarin and therefore had an interpreter with him in meetings. But then the board representation problem gets more complicated, because the way Fonterra tells the story, it says that because it only has a minority stake in Being Made, it doesn't have full access to what's going on in Being Made, nor can its two representatives on the board give it a full debrief. In other words, it's not. Fonterra believes it's not supposed to know more than general investors would. I actually don't understand that point at all, but that's the point that Fonterra makes. So it would seem that Fonterra had very little idea of what was going on inside Being Made. Even before Fonterra took its stake in March of 2015, the company, during the process that Fonterra was buying those shares, reported a dreadful set of results for the fiscal year 2014. Ended December 2014, a serious drop in revenues, almost a 90% drop in profits. But Fonterra seemed undeterred. In fact, it actually paid more than it expected to for those shares.
So did it not do its proper due diligence?
It says it did. I have asked questions about that due diligence report, and Fonterra says, no, that's a confidential document.
It's hard to ignore the successes of A2 Milk and Synlait Milk's performances in China, and that seems to be thanks in large part to the role of e-commerce. Can you talk about what the role of e-commerce really needs to be in terms of Fonterra's future in China?
The big change in China was the very rapid rise of e-commerce, so away from those bricks and mortar stores. Being Made failed to respond to that at all well, and the first problem was it had seriously annoyed many of those stores out there, because prior to this shift to e-commerce, it had sought to claw back margin, i.e. increase its share of the take from those independent stores. And so there was a lot of unhappiness out in the network anyway. But in terms of e-commerce, again, the details are sparse, but it's really clear from what we know that Being Made was behind as the market shifted to e-commerce. To me, the most interesting evidence that Fonterra wasn't on top of this comes from McKinsey. So McKinsey is the global management consultants, very long involved with the dairy industry here. In the 1990s, it was McKinsey that drew up the plan that resulted in the creation of Fonterra. And we know that McKinsey's been involved in in a number of very large projects in Fonterra since. In that period, at the end of 2014 and into 2015, remember at that point, Fonterra had committed to take the stake in Being Made, but it hadn't done the deal until the following March when it bought the shares. But in that time, McKinsey was putting out for free to the general public its views on how best businesses could, foreign businesses could work in China. And it focused a lot on the nature of joint ventures. It focused an awful lot, and had lots of advice on that. It focused an awful lot on this huge surge of e-commerce coming. Already, e-commerce back in 2014 had a larger share of Chinese retail sales than e-commerce did in the United States. And the point McKinsey was making was that all the infrastructure was in place for an even more rapid shift, particularly amongst consumers who had never become particularly hooked on bricks and mortar shopping. They're kind of new to shopping and were jumping straight into e-commerce. And indeed, that's exactly what was happening. But again, that was obvious when Fonterra was taking its stake. So that's why I find it curious that in trying to explain in subsequent years, Spearings and Wilson trying to explain why being mate hadn't worked out, it kept blaming the market for shifting, not being mate for failing to keep up with the market.
You've also criticized Fonterra's claim about having the largest share of stomach in China. What's wrong with this claim or aim?
Fonterra set itself and has achieved an extraordinary goal in China. It has the largest share of stomach, i.e. Amongst dairy products, it sells by volume more dairy products than even the largest Chinese company. Well, that's an amazing achievement. However, it seems to me completely inconceivable that the Chinese government would let a foreign company have the leading market share in any field, but particularly a nutrition one. From what we know about China and its strategic priorities, it seems contrary, a goal like that on the part of Fonterra seems contrary to the sort of support of domestic companies and security in sectors that the Chinese government is very strategically always working on. But the other problem is that Fonterra is the largest seller by volume, but not by value. And that takes us right back to the problem of Fonterra overall, is that it's the second largest dairy processor in the world, but it is only 18th in terms of the revenue per kilogram of milk, or litre of milk. The two are almost synonymous. And that's a problem. I mean, that's a problem across all of Fonterra's business, but it's particularly a problem in China.
And in going into being mate, you noted in your talk that Fonterra, there was no exit mechanism built into the agreement. So where does that leave Fonterra in terms of its relationship with being mate?
It's one of the most fundamental points that any company organizing a joint venture or a strategic relationship with another company, they work out what the exit strategy is, and they establish that with high hopes for the future, but knowing that often agendas diverge over time because the company's own priorities differ or whatever.
The dreams change.
Yeah, indeed, the dreams change. And I've seen no evidence that there is such an exit mechanism with being mate. So that then leads us to the very interesting question of what happens now at being mate. I've detected two quite different views or from my limited contacts in China as to what happens now. The first view is that there is now an opportunity to have a China Inc. response to being mate. And that's finally happened because two local roadblocks in Hangzhou, which is a very large, wealthy city, high-tech city southwest of Shanghai, the local mayor was very protective of being mate, as was the local branch of being mate's main bank. But there is a new mayor, so the story goes, and the bank has re-exerted authority over its local subsidiary. So now there is hope from one person I've spoken to that could be China Inc. could rally round being mate. But I asked this person, so what's the role of Fonterra in that? And he said there isn't one. So I don't know what that means. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that being mate has some good hard assets, plants and recipes, which would be worth a lot to another company, preferably it wouldn't have to be, but it could be a foreign company, but you could imagine one of the other major Chinese dairy companies wanting to have that capability, in which case such a bid might eventuate for being mate. And Fonterra, with only an 18.8% stake in it, would have next to no say in that. And should the buyer not want Fonterra in the picture, I have no idea what the contractual arrangements Fonterra has with being mate and whether they would still roll over or not. But again, that seems to leave Fonterra in a very insecure position. So that's why I question whether the current value of the being mate stake, which is $244 million, down from $750 million, which is the value that PwC, Fonterra's auditors, put on it at the half-year results. I just have no idea whether that value can ever be realized.
So given all this, what are the long-term prospects for Fonterra doing business in China?
Should being mate fold in some way or be wrapped into some other business or be delisted from the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, which it is in danger of doing because of its continuing losses, be forcibly delisted. One view is that this is another black mark on Fonterra's reputation in China after Sanyu and the false botulism scare and then being mate. So it'd be the third in barely a decade. Other views are somewhat more favorable because Fonterra does seem to be respected in the food service and consumer parts of the market and does seem to be doing some innovative things and is investing in a third farming hub with Abbott, the American producer of infant formula. It has enough good stuff going on there to still be a good business for it in China, but also to be a good base for it to, if its reputation is damaged, to repair that over time. But if I had to make a guess, I stress it's a guess, as to whether being mate is in or out of that picture, I find it really hard to see how it could possibly be in the Fonterra picture in that.